There's a house on a hill outside a small Hudson Valley town that has 40 rooms and not one single sound in it. No music, no footsteps that aren't measured and careful. No laughter, not for 2 years, not once. If you'd stood in the front hall of Larkspur Manor on any given evening, you'd have sworn the place was empty. It wasn't. It just belonged to a man who'd forgotten how to take up space in his own life. That man was Julian Hale, 36 years old, worth more money than most small countries. And so hollowed out by grief that his own housekeepers were quitting, rather than spend another week in his silence. This is the story of how a 3-year-old girl who wasn't supposed to be in that house at all ended up saving it. And him, with nothing but an off-key song about a duck. Julian had built 3 companies from nothing. He had 2 jets sitting in a private hangar an hour from the manor, a pool shaped like a teardrop, and closets full of suits he never wore twice. None of it meant anything anymore. It hadn't since the night, a little over 2 years back, when his wife Nora and their unborn daughter died on a stretch of wet highway on their way home from a birthday dinner Julian had missed because he was closing a $40 million acquisition 3 states away. He wasn't driving that night, he wasn't even in the car, and he never once let himself forget it. Every evening since, he sat in his study with the lights low, a photo of Nora on the side table, and he didn't cry. He'd used up all his tears somewhere around month 4. What was left was quieter than sadness, a kind of static that filled every room he walked into, so that the staff had started calling him, behind his back and not unkindly, the ghost who signs the checks. 6 housekeepers had come and gone in the past year alone. The job listing didn't say it outright, but everyone in the local staffing agency knew. Whoever took the live-in position at Larkspur needed to be able to survive that silence without flinching. That's how Renata Cruz ended up standing in the manor's kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, twisting the strap of her bag in her hands and trying not to look as desperate as she felt. Renata was 33, a single mother. Her ex had left when their daughter, Mia, was barely walking, and since then it had been the 2 of them against every bill that came in the mail. She'd been working a daytime shift at a diner and a night shift cleaning offices, and she was so tired that some mornings she couldn't remember which day of the week it was. When the agency called about a live-in position, full room and board, a salary that made her sit down on her kitchen floor when she heard the number, she said yes before the woman on the phone had even finished the sentence. "I should tell you," the agency coordinator had said carefully, "the owner is difficult, withdrawn, the last woman left after 5 days. "I've worked for difficult," Renata told her. She was thinking about rent, not warnings. There was only one problem. The position came with housing for Renata alone, no children. Larkspur wasn't a family household, hadn't been one in a long time, though the coordinator didn't say why, and the contract was explicit on that point. But Renata didn't have a sister 3 towns over, or a mother who could watch Mia, or the money for daycare on top of everything else. So on her first morning, she made a decision that could have gotten her fired before she'd unpacked a single box. She buckled 4-year-old, no, 3, Mia had just turned 3 that winter. She buckled Mia into the back of the estate's shuttle car and prayed the driver wouldn't ask questions. He didn't. He'd clearly stopped asking questions about this house a long time ago. "You have to be a mouse today, Mija," Renata told her daughter on the long gravel drive, the manor rising up through the trees like something out of a storybook. "The quietest little mouse there ever was. Can you do that for me?" Mia's eyes went wide and round, taking in the size of the place. "Does a prince live there?" Renata laughed, really laughed for the first time in weeks. "Something like that, baby." She had no way of knowing the prince in question hadn't smiled in 700 and some days. That the house her daughter thought looked like a fairy tale was, underneath all that stone and glass, a place where grief sat in the corners like dust nobody bothered to sweep. Mia didn't know any of that. She was 3. She was curious and fast and had absolutely no intention of staying anywhere she was told to stay. It happened within hours. While Renata was upstairs being walked through supply closets and laundry schedules by the estate manager, Mia slipped away, down a hallway lined with portraits of people she'd never meet, past a staircase wide enough to drive a car up, until she found a door standing open a few inches. Inside was a room with a huge window looking out over the gardens, a cold fireplace, and a man sitting alone in a leather chair, staring at absolutely nothing. She didn't know it was his study. She didn't know it was the room where Julian Hale spent every night doing the same thing, sitting, staring, waiting for a feeling that never came. All she saw was a sad man by himself in a room that felt too big for one person. In her 3-year-old logic, that was a problem, and problems were things you fixed. "Why are you sad?" she asked, walking straight up to him, barefoot on a rug that cost more than most cars. Julian looked up so sharply it startled him more than her. He hadn't heard the door. He hadn't heard footsteps at all. Mia moved through the world like she'd been specifically designed to sneak past adults. For a second, he just stared. Tangled dark curls, a purple dress with a juice stain on the collar, and an age that hit him somewhere just under his ribs. Because she was almost exactly the age his own daughter would have been. "Who are you?" he managed, his voice rusty from disuse. "Mia," she said, like that explained everything worth knowing. Then, without waiting for an invitation, she climbed up into the chair beside him, wedging her small body into the narrow gap between his arm and the armrest. "You look sad like my mommy gets sometimes," she informed him. "I sing to her when she's sad. Want one?" He hadn't said yes. He didn't get the chance to say anything at all before she opened her mouth and started singing, wildly off-key, about a duck who'd lost his way home and couldn't find the pond. Something in Julian Hale's chest, something that had been sealed shut for 730 days, cracked. Not broken open, not yet, just cracked the way ice does right before it gives. He didn't cry, but for the first time since the accident, he listened. Really listened, the way you listen to something you're afraid might stop. Renata found them 20 minutes later, and her heart nearly gave out on the spot. She'd been calling Mia's name in a strangled whisper up and down the second floor, checking behind curtains and under side tables, panic climbing higher with every empty room. When she finally reached the study and saw her daughter curled against the arm of Julian Hale, the man 3 different housekeepers had warned her never, under any circumstances, to disturb, the floor seemed to drop away from under her feet. "Oh my God, I am so sorry, sir." The words tumbled out of her as she crossed the room and scooped Mia off the chair, pulling her close like she could physically undo the last 20 minutes. "I told her to stay upstairs, I swear, she wanders, I'm so sorry, please," she braced for it. The cold dismissal. The 2 words she'd been dreading since the moment she smuggled her daughter through the front gate. "You're fired." Julian's face wasn't angry, though. It was something Renata couldn't quite name, something raw, like a bruise just starting to show. "She sang to me," he said quietly. Renata blinked. I'm sorry, sir, she doesn't really understand. I said she sang to me." He repeated it slower, like the sentence surprised him coming out of his own mouth. "Nobody's done that in this house in a very long time." The silence that followed felt different from every other silence Renata had heard in her 4 hours at Larkspur. It wasn't the cold, empty kind the agency woman had warned her about. It was the kind that comes when someone's remembering something they'd buried on purpose. "I have to let you go," Julian said finally, and Renata's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "Children were never part of the arrangement. You knew the terms. Please," her voice cracked. "Please, sir, I have nowhere else, no family up here. I can't do daycare and rent both. I'll keep her quiet. I'll keep her upstairs every second of every day." "You won't even—" "I have to let you go," he interrupted, "from the position you applied for." He looked down at Mia, who was watching him with the same fearless curiosity as before, completely unaware that her mother's entire future was balanced on this one conversation. "Because I'd like to offer you a different one. Live-in housekeeper, same terms, same pay, except the girl stays too, openly, no hiding her." Renata's mouth actually fell open. "Sir, I don't understand." "Neither do I," and for just a second, something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face before it disappeared again. Like a bulb that couldn't quite hold its charge. "But it's been 2 years since anything in this house made me feel a single thing. I'm not ready to lose that 5 minutes after finding it." He didn't explain about Nora. He didn't explain about the daughter he'd lost, who would have turned 3 that same year, or the room upstairs he still couldn't make himself walk into. He wasn't ready to say any of that out loud to a woman he'd known for less than a day. But something about this barefoot, fearless little person singing in his study without an ounce of hesitation had reached a part of him he'd assumed was gone for good. "Thank you," Renata whispered, eyes wet. "Thank you, sir." "Julian," he said. "Just Julian is fine." That night, tucking Mia into a real bed in their new quarters, a room with an actual window looking out over the gardens. Not a hidden corner somewhere, Renata asked the question that had been sitting on her chest all evening. "Why'd you go in that room, baby? I told you to wait upstairs." Mia considered this with the total seriousness only a 3-year-old can bring to a question. "He looked lonely," she said finally. "Like the man in my book, the one nobody visits." Renata didn't know which book her daughter meant, but something warm and aching moved through her chest anyway. Her daughter, 3 years old, no fear of the world yet, had walked straight into a stranger's grief because all she'd seen was a person who needed a friend. Down the hall in his study, Julian sat by the window a long time that night, turning over the memory of an off-key song about a lost duck. And for the first time in 730 days, he wasn't dreading what tomorrow would bring. He was curious about it. If you've ever had someone small walk into your life and rearrange everything without asking permission, you already know this story isn't close to over. Stay with me. Morning came, as it always did for Mia, absurdly early. She woke before the sun, decided she was starving, and this being also entirely normal, wandered off in search of food, while Renata was downstairs going over the household's breakfast schedule. She found the kitchen by smell alone, and there she found Julian, sitting by himself at a table built to seat 20, eating breakfast the way he did every single morning, alone. With a newspaper he wasn't reading folded beside his plate, and a coffee he'd refilled 3 times and barely touched. "Can I sit?" Mia asked, already dragging the chair out before he'd said a word. "I suppose you've already decided that for both of us," Julian said. Yep, she climbed up into a seat far too big for her, looking enormously pleased with herself. The chef, a nervous, precise man named Theo who'd worked at Larkspur for 6 years and had never once seen his employer take breakfast with company, nearly dropped a tray at the sight. He recovered fast enough to slide a small plate of pancakes, cut into careful little squares, in front of her without being asked. "You don't make round ones here," Mia observed, studying her plate like it had personally disappointed her. "At my house, Mommy makes them shaped like a mouse. Ears and everything." "I'll have a word with the kitchen about that oversight," Julian said, and there was the faintest, driest thread of humor in it, so faint that Theo actually stopped in the doorway just to make sure he'd heard it right. Mia ate with her hands, ignored the fork entirely, and talked the whole time about things that made sense to no one but her. A dream involving a talking dog. A boy at daycare named Marcus who ate crayons. Her theory that the moon followed their car around specifically because it liked them best. Julian found himself listening to every word of it. He hadn't understood how loud silence could get until something finally interrupted it. For 2 years, the house had pressed down on him like a physical weight. But sitting there, listening to a 3-year-old explain, at great length, why her stuffed rabbit was secretly the president of a small, unnamed country, the silence didn't feel heavy at all. It felt like it had finally been given permission to breathe. When Renata came rushing in, alarmed to find her daughter had wandered off yet again, she stopped dead in the doorway. Her employer, the man the entire staff described as untouchable, had syrup on his sleeve and was listening, rapt, to a toddler's nonsense with something dangerously close to a smile. "I'm so sorry, she knows she's supposed to wait for me." "She's fine," Julian said. Then, like the words caught him off guard on their way out, "She's welcome to join me every morning if she likes." Renata blinked. "Sir, you really don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He looked at Mia, who was already reaching for a second pancake. "I'd like to," and that was how it started. Every morning at 7, Mia appeared in the kitchen in her pajamas, climbed into the too-big chair, and reported the state of her dreams, her stuffed animals, and her strong opinions on breakfast food, while a man who ran 3 companies listened like it was the most important meeting on his calendar. Slowly, over the weeks that followed, the household began shifting in ways nobody could have predicted. Julian started coming home before dark instead of staying at the office past midnight to avoid the quiet house. He started eating dinner at the table instead of alone in his study. One Sunday afternoon, he let Mia drag him out to the garden to search, with total conviction, for the fairies she insisted lived under the rose bushes. The staff noticed. They talked about it in careful, hopeful whispers in the break room, half afraid to say out loud what they were all thinking, that somehow this one small, stubborn girl was doing what nobody else had managed in 2 years. She was bringing Julian Hale back, but grief doesn't just evaporate because someone's smiling again. It waits. And 2 floors above the kitchen, behind a door Julian hadn't opened in over 700 days, sat a room that held the exact shape of everything he'd lost. A nursery, painted soft yellow, that had never once been slept in. 3 months passed, and Larkspur had become an entirely different kind of house. Mia had her own chair at breakfast now, no longer borrowed, and small scattered toys in rooms that used to be untouched showpieces. Renata had settled in, no longer bracing for the axe to fall, though she stayed careful, always watching to make sure her daughter's presence was a comfort to Julian and never a burden. Julian himself had changed enough that the staff talked about it like a minor miracle. He laughed now, sometimes a rusty, rare sound, usually triggered by something absurd Mia had said or done. One door in the house, though, stayed locked. Mia, who had never once met a closed door she didn't want to open, had rattled that particular handle more than once before Renata gently steered her away, telling her it wasn't a room for playing. "Why not? It's Mr. Julian's private room, Mija. We don't go in there." What Renata didn't tell her daughter, because she herself only knew it in fragments, pieced together from hushed conversations with the older staff, was that the room behind that door was the nursery Julian and Nora had finished 2 weeks before the crash. A crib, a rocking chair with a blanket folded over the arm the way you leave something when you plan to come right back, and don't yet know you never will. A mobile of felt stars, still waiting to spin over a baby who never arrived. Julian hadn't crossed that threshold in 791 days. One rainy afternoon, while Renata was occupied with a delivery at the front gate, Mia wandered off again, a habit her mother had mostly stopped fighting, since it kept leading to good things. This time she ended up outside that same door, and to her surprise, it wasn't locked. Someone dusting the hallway had left it open a crack without realizing what it was. Mia pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had been left, frozen, soft yellow walls, a white crib with felt stars hanging above it, motionless, a rocking chair by the window. And in the corner of the crib, a small stuffed lamb Nora had bought during her pregnancy, waiting for a baby who never got to hold it. Mia lifted it carefully, the way she'd been taught to hold things that mattered, and she was still standing there, lamb in her arms, when Julian walked past the hallway and saw the door hanging open. His whole body went cold. He hadn't set foot in that room in over 2 years. Every time he'd thought about opening that door, his chest closed up so tight he could barely breathe. And now, through the gap, he could see a small figure standing in the middle of the nursery, holding the exact thing his wife had picked out with so much hope. "Mia," he said, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Come out of there, sweetheart." She turned, holding the lamb up like an offering. "Whose baby is this room for?" He couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Every part of him wanted to shut the door and walk away before the grief knocked him flat. But Mia just stood there, patient, unafraid, waiting for an answer with the plain honesty only a child can offer. "It was for my daughter," he finally said, and the words broke apart on the last one. "Her name was Wren. She never slept in that crib, never held that lamb. She and my wife died before Wren was even born." A car accident? He hadn't said it out loud like that, not fully, not since the funeral. Saying it to a 3-year-old should have felt strange, pointless even. Instead, it felt like setting down something impossibly heavy that he'd been hauling by himself for 2 years. Mia walked toward him slowly, still holding the lamb, and held it out. "She'd want you to have it," she said simply. "So you're not sad all alone." Julian Hale, 36 years old, one of the wealthiest men in the state, sank to his knees in the doorway of his daughter's unused nursery and cried for the first time in 791 days. He cried for Nora. He cried for Wren. He cried for every birthday, every first step, every first word he'd never get to see. And through all of it, a 3-year-old stood next to him with one small hand on his shoulder, not saying anything else. Just staying. That was the moment everything really started to turn. Word travels fast in a house with 40 rooms, And by the next morning, every member of the staff knew Mr. Hale had finally walked into that nursery. Nobody said a word about it to his face. But the air in the house was different after that, lighter, like a storm had finally broken. What happened next is the part nobody in that house saw coming. Renata found Julian in the nursery that evening, the rocking chair creaking gently as he sat with the stuffed lamb in his lap, staring up at the motionless mobile of stars. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly from the doorway. "Mia shouldn't have gone in there. I'll talk to her. I promise it won't." "Don't," Julian said, turning to look at her. His eyes were still red, but there was something steadier in his face than she'd ever seen there. "Don't tell her not to." She did in 5 minutes what 2 years of therapy couldn't. Renata stepped inside slowly, unsure if she was even allowed. "Can I ask what happened?" "If it's not too much." So he told her all of it. Nora, Ren, the rain-slicked highway, the crushing weight of not being in that car. 2 years of moving through his own house like a stranger inside it. Renata listened without a single interruption, her chest aching for a man who had every material thing in the world and none of the things that actually mattered. "I don't know how to thank you," Julian said finally. "Either of you. I know I haven't been easy to work for." "You've never been anything but decent to us," Renata said honestly. "From day one, when you could have fired me on the spot for sneaking her in, you gave us a home instead." "She gave me one first," he said, looking back at the empty crib. "I just didn't realize how empty mine had gotten until she walked into it." From that day on, something unspoken shifted between the three of them. Julian started joining Renata and Mia for dinner most nights, not just breakfast. He read Mia bedtime stories when Renata was still finishing her rounds, sitting at the edge of a small bed doing all the character voices badly, but trying harder than he'd tried at anything in years. Saturdays, he took Mia to the little carousel downtown, holding her hand tight while she rode the same chipped painted horse over and over, laughing every single time like it was brand new. The staff, who'd spent 2 years tiptoeing around their employer, started to relax too. The house that had been silent for so long slowly filled back up with sound, Mia's laughter bouncing off the marble halls, Julian's rare real smile showing up more often at dinner. Even Renata humming while she worked, something she hadn't done since before her marriage fell apart. Julian started calling them, quietly at first and then not so quietly, his family. Nothing official, no paperwork. But in every way that counted, that's exactly what they'd become. A grieving man, a hard-working mother, and a fearless little girl, stitched together by loss and somehow by love in equal measure. Not everyone was thrilled about it. Julian's fiancée, Camille Voss, had been in Europe for 4 months handling what she called family matters, which mostly meant spending Julian's money in a lifestyle far away from a manor she found suffocatingly quiet and sad. When she came back and heard, through the usual gossip of mutual friends, that her fiancé had grown suspiciously attached to his housekeeper and her toddler, something cold settled behind her perfectly done makeup. Camille had been engaged to Julian for 8 months, ever since she'd expertly maneuvered her way into his orbit at a charity gala. Sensing an opportunity in a grieving billionaire that she fully intended to make the most of. She'd been counting down to the wedding, and more precisely, counting the zeros in the prenup she was still trying to renegotiate. A toddler was not part of her timeline. "We need to talk about the housekeeper situation," Camille announced the evening she landed, walking into Julian's study without knocking, heels sharp against the hardwood. Julian looked up from a children's book he'd been quietly practicing so he could read it properly to Mia that night. Something in his expression had shifted in the 4 months Camille had been gone. He looked less like a man drowning and more like one who'd finally found ground to stand on. "What situation?" "The child," Camille said, voice tightening. "It's inappropriate, Julian. People are talking, you playing house with the staff's daughter. That stops the moment we're married." Julian set the book down slowly and looked at his fiancée with an expression she'd never once seen on him. Clarity. "I think," he said quietly, "we need to talk about several things." The conversation lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it, Julian understood things about his own engagement he'd somehow managed to overlook for 8 straight months. Camille had never once asked about Ren, never asked to see a photo, never even acknowledged the nursery existed. She'd suggested, gently and repeatedly, that he sell the estate and start fresh somewhere without old weight hanging over everything. She had, he now realized with a sick twist in his stomach, been quietly trying to erase Nora and Ren from his life, not with love, but with convenience. When he finally told her that Renata and Mia weren't going anywhere, the mask came off completely. "Do you hear yourself?" Camille snapped, all the sweetness gone. A grown man getting attached to his maid's kid like she's some kind of miracle cure. It's pathetic. It's embarrassing for both of us. "Get out," Julian said, quiet, final. "Excuse me, get out, Camille, tonight. And take the ring." What followed was ugly, accusations, talk of her investment in the relationship, a veiled threat about what his business partners might hear about his erratic behavior. Julian let her say all of it without flinching, because for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't afraid of losing anything. He'd already lost the two people who mattered most. He wasn't about to lose the two who'd brought him back, just to keep the peace with someone who'd never actually cared for him at all. Camille didn't leave quietly. On her way out, she found Renata in the kitchen and delivered one last cutting remark. Something about enjoying her little fantasy while it lasted, because men like Julian Hale didn't marry the help. No matter how cute their kid was. Renata didn't respond. She closed the kitchen door behind Camille and stood there a long moment, hands shaking not from anger, but from a fear she'd been carrying quietly for weeks. The fear that this whole unexpected life they'd built here was too good to hold on to. Julian found her there 20 minutes later and knew immediately something was wrong. "She said something to you," Renata told him carefully, trying to make it sound smaller than it was. His jaw tightened in a way she'd never seen. "She's wrong," he said. "About all of it. Julian, you don't have to, I mean it." He stepped closer, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face. "These last 3 months, you and Mia haven't just worked in this house. You made it a home again. I don't know exactly what this is between us. But I know it isn't nothing, and I know it isn't temporary." Renata's eyes filled. "I never expected any of this," she admitted. "I took this job because I was desperate." "I never thought, neither did I," Julian said softly. "But I'm not interested in going back to how things were before a 3-year-old walked into my study and sang me a song about a lost duck. It wasn't a declaration of love. Not quite, not yet. But it was the start of something honest, built not on convenience or status, the way it had been with Camille, but on the slow, unglamorous work of showing up for each other, day after day. A year like that changes people. It changes a house, too. But the moment that actually rewrote everything was still coming, and it happened, of all places, in a room full of folding chairs. It happened on a Tuesday evening, almost exactly 1 year after Renata and Mia first arrived at Larkspur. Mia, now 4 and every bit as fearless as the day she'd wandered uninvited into a stranger's study, had been signed up to sing in her preschool's tiny end-of-year program, a room of folding chairs. Proud parents and a dozen 3- and 4-year-olds mumbling their way through simple songs. In the grand scheme of things, it was nothing. To Julian, sitting in the audience beside Renata for the first time as something like an actual family, it felt like the biggest event of his entire year. He'd never been to anything like it before. Not for Ren, she never got the chance. Watching Mia walk up to the front in a Sunday dress 2 sizes too big, gripping the hem the way she never did when she was nervous. Julian felt his chest tighten with something he could barely name: pride, grief, and a fierce, overwhelming love for a little girl who wasn't his by blood, but had become in every way that counted. His daughter, too. Mia scanned the crowd until she found them in the second row, and her nervous face broke into a huge, gap-toothed grin. Then, in a clear, cheerfully off-key voice that carried across the whole room, she started to sing, not the assigned class song about counting to 10, but the silly little duck song she'd sung Julian that very first day in his study. The one about a duck who lost his way home and found it again. She'd chosen it on purpose. She told them later, with the simple certainty only kids have, that it was the fixing song, and she wanted everybody to hear it. Julian was crying before he even realized it, and beside him Renata reached over and took his hand, gripping it tight, both of them watching the small, brave girl who'd once walked straight into a stranger's grief without any fear at all, and sung him back to life. Afterward, as parents gathered up their kids in the noise and chaos of the room, Julian knelt down and Mia ran straight into his arms, the way she always did. "You did wonderful," he told her, voice thick. "I sang the fixing song," she said proudly. "For you and Mommy both." Julian looked up at Renata over Mia's shoulder, and something passed between them, an understanding that had been quietly building for a full year. That night, once Mia was asleep, worn out from her big performance, Julian sat with Renata on the porch overlooking the same garden where Mia had once insisted on hunting for fairies. "I want to ask you something," Julian said, nervous in a way that seemed strange coming from a man who could negotiate a 9-figure deal without blinking. "And I need you to know it's not gratitude and it's not loneliness. It's exactly what it sounds like. I love you, Renata. I love the family we've put together, even though it's nothing like the one either of us expected to have." Her eyes filled. "Julian, I'm not asking you to marry me tonight," he said quickly, almost laughing at his own nerves. "I just needed you to know that. Whatever comes next, I needed you to hear it." "I love you too," Renata whispered, "both of you. This past year has felt like the family I always wanted and never thought I'd get." 6 months later, in a small, quiet ceremony in that same garden, Julian and Renata got married. No press. No grand announcement. None of the extravagance people usually associated with a man of Julian Hale's wealth, just close friends. The household staff who'd watched this family stitch itself back together one small moment at a time, and in the front row, a 5-year-old flower girl in a purple dress throwing rose petals with far more enthusiasm than aim. Julian legally adopted Mia later that same year. The day it became official, he took her up to the nursery, the same room she'd wandered into on that rainy afternoon, transformed now. The yellow walls stayed, a quiet tribute to the daughter he'd lost, but the room was different, Mia's drawings taped up everywhere. A new reading nook where Julian read to her every night without fail. "This can be your room if you want it," he told her, "or we build you something totally different, whatever you want." Mia thought about it with her usual gravity, then shook her head. "I want to keep it like this," she said. "So Wren's still here too. We can be sisters even though I never met her." Julian Hale, once known across the county as the coldest, saddest billionaire in the state, sat down on the floor of that nursery with the daughter fate had handed him in the most unexpected way imaginable, and felt, for the first time in years, that his heart was finally, completely whole. It had taken a housekeeper's courage, a toddler's fearless heart, and one small song about a lost duck finding his way home. But in the end, that's exactly what happened to all three of them. They found their way home. Okay, I want to know what you'd have done in Renata's shoes, standing in that gravel driveway with a rule book that said no children and a kid asleep in the backseat anyway. Would you have taken the risk? And where are you listening from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this one got you, hit like, subscribe for more stories like it, and tell me below what part hit hardest. I'll see you in the next one.